A staggering 1 in 2 of us will develop a mental illness sometime in our lives. For most people, it'll be mild to moderate anxiety or depression. But a significant proportion will experience severe mental illness. And many of these people have children. The question is, what is the impact of that severe mental illness on these kids growing up?
I started to try and understand my mum and kind of look after her in whatever ways I could. I remember as a young person, I used to wonder, why does she kind of talk about all this weird stuff in the backyard, and she'd draw these weird symbols and write these sentences which didn't make sense. And as a young person, I thought, if I can just listen to her enough, one day I'll crack the code, and what that will give me is the ability to communicate with her, and maybe I'll be able to kind of solve schizophrenia.
One concern for children of people who have severe mental illness is whether they'll get it themselves, either because of genes or because of the environment they've grown up in. Did you ever fear for your own sanity?
Some people develop mental health issues themselves, and sometimes those people are in your own family. And so I started to wonder a little bit about that because I've kind of really had a mentality or a philosophy that life is so rich and complex and unpredictable. It simply is what it is. We can't know the future, so what we can do is kind of live day by day and just live as good a life as we can. You might develop mental illness because you've got 2 or 3 people in your family who have it. It's not a really helpful story.
Dr. Kimberly Dean has studied the mental health of offspring in the entire Danish population.
We looked at parents who had a range of mental disorders, severe and other mental disorders, and then examined their offspring and looked at the full spectrum of mental disorders that could occur. And we found basically that the pattern was that there was a general vulnerability for offspring. So if you had a parent with schizophrenia, you also had an elevated risk as an offspring of having a substance misuse problem, or an anxiety disorder, or a depressive disorder. So it wasn't confined to those disorders that are similar to their parents. The other interesting thing that we did was to look at whether 2 parents were disordered and whether that combined impact. And that was really noticeable across offspring disorders. If you had 2 disordered parents, whatever they had, the risk for offspring was very high. So parents, if you had 2 parents with a severe mental illness like bipolar or schizophrenia, which is obviously rare in a population, but that combination, offspring had a 13 times elevated risk of schizophrenia. But they also had an 8 times elevated risk of substance misuse, which you wouldn't normally consider to be genetically or environmentally directly linked. Because this was a large population study, we couldn't separate the effects of genes in the environment, but my view is that it's likely to be a combination. But what the study highlights is that it's a combination of general vulnerability. So there may well be risk genes that apply across disorders, and risky environments that apply across disorders. I think it's important to recognise that although this study is focused on family history, the vast majority of people who have mental health problems don't have a parental history of mental disorders. So that was true of 4/5 of my sample. And in addition to that, if you do have a parent with mental disorder, you're still much more likely not to develop disorder yourself. So that has to be borne in mind.
Describe the worst of times and the best of times.
I think one of a story that kind of tells me about the worst of times is once being in the city going to the movies with 3 friends of mine. We're at Pizza Hut having all-you-can-eat pizza, trying to outdo each other, and all of a sudden there was this commotion and people were kind of looking over towards the entrance, and a manager was trying to usher out this woman, and there was this screaming and shouting and people were kind of all looking over, and one of my friends said, "That's your mum." And I looked at my friend and I said, "That's not my mum." It was, but I didn't want to own that. He said, "Well, that's your mum, Nicholas." And for the second time I said to him, "That's not my mum." I went home that night and I reflected on that, and I was really quite tearful and sad about that, because in some sense I tried to disown my own mum, but for good reason. And so there was my double worlds. The world of just wanting to be a normal kid growing up doing normal things, but the harsh reality that mental illness was actually in our family, and mum was different, and that actually certainly affected us in many, many different ways.
The other thing we looked at was the gender of the parent who was affected by mental disorder. And we